Tonight, as the world outside grows quiet and your breathing begins to slow, let's gently drift back into a distant medieval past, a time when humanity unknowingly walked a fragile line between survival and self-destruction, not because of great cosmic disasters or terrifying monsters, but because of deeply trusted ideas that quietly worked against the people who believed in them. As doctors with sincere confidence drained blood from already weakened bodies, convinced that balance could only be restored through loss, opening veins again and again while mistaking fainting for healing and silence for success, never realizing that sickness worsened not from excess but from exhaustion, while entire communities followed dietary advice that warned against fresh fruits and vegetables during famine, labeling them dangerous and corrupting, encouraging people instead to eat heavy foods that were scarce or to avoid eating altogether, slowly starving bodies that desperately needed strength, turning hunger into a moral exercise where suffering was seen as discipline and death as divine judgment, all while cities themselves quietly conspired against their inhabitants, built dense and dark with narrow streets that trapped air and life alike, where waste flowed freely into rivers assumed to possess cleansing magic, rivers that were later used for drinking, washing, and brewing, spreading invisible illness from one home to the next as people blamed bad air, foreign influence, or the stars rather than the water passing through their hands, and when fear demanded a visible enemy, cats became symbols of suspicion and evil, hunted and destroyed in the belief that removing them would cleanse communities, unaware that with the cats gone rats would flourish, fleas would thrive, and disease would spread faster than ever. Yet instead of questioning the outcome, societies doubled down, convinced that worsening plague meant not enough action had been taken, while others turned to dramatic displays of devotion, marching from town to town, whipping themselves in crowded streets, believing pain would earn divine mercy, unknowingly transforming disease into a traveling companion carried on breath, sweat, and shared space, spreading illness to places that might otherwise have been spared. All of this unfolding within cities where multiple families shared single rooms, animals slept beside people, refuse filled streets, and quarantine meant little more than standing a step farther from someone coughing. Environments where disease did not struggle to survive but thrived effortlessly, and yet through all these confident missteps, humanity endured, not because the systems worked, but because life persisted long enough for observation to slowly replace belief, for experience to challenge tradition, and for small lessons to accumulate across generations, allowing people to eventually stop bleeding the sick, to question hunger as virtue, to suspect water as a carrier rather than a cleanser, to understand the balance between fear and reason. And now, as these long shadows of the past fade softly into history, there is no need to stay alert or afraid, because these stories exist only as echoes meant to lull rather than alarm, reminders of how fragile progress once was and how far it has quietly come. So let your thoughts loosen their grip. Allow the mistakes of the past to dissolve into calm understanding, and rest comfortably knowing that tonight there is nothing to fix, nothing to fight, and nothing to fear, only the gentle rhythm of history fading away as sleep slowly, steadily, and peacefully takes over. As medieval cities continued to grow person by person, street by street, wall by wall, people made a quiet choice without ever announcing it out loud, deciding that it was somehow better to die together behind stone walls than to survive alone beyond them. And once sickness proved that it did not politely stop at city gates, society urgently needed something visible to blame, because invisible causes felt unreliable unless they were angels, demons, or saints with strong opinions. So fear stepped in to do the thinking, and fear demanded targets, turning suspicion toward witches, outsiders, healers, widows, midwives, beggars, foreigners, and anyone who lived slightly differently, until being unusual itself became dangerous. And communities convinced themselves that destroying the wrong people might disinfect reality, lighting fires, rushing trials, and replacing evidence with certainty, never noticing that disease did not attend executions or respect confessions, while the removal of healers reduced care, public punishments gathered crowds, and panic sent people fleeing with sickness into new regions, creating a self-feeding cycle where worsening illness was interpreted as proof that not enough blame had been assigned yet. And at the same time, medieval medicine continued its own quiet assault, prescribing carefully measured poisons like mercury, lead, and arsenic with complete confidence, believing that violent reactions meant success, that vomiting and weakness were signs of healing, and that if patients died, it simply meant the illness had been stronger than the cure, never considering the possibility that the cure itself was the problem, while authority protected these practices from doubt, because refusing treatment was irresponsible and questioning tradition was dangerous, especially during epidemics. When desperation made people swallow anything recommended, stacking poison upon poison until sickbeds became unregulated experiments, all while death itself began to outpace organization, bodies accumulating faster than burial rituals could manage, filling homes, streets, and churches, forcing families to live beside their dead for days as air thickened and decay quietly seeped into water and soil. Mass graves dug hastily wherever space allowed, rain washing consequences downhill, insects flourishing, animals digging, and fear of corpses delaying removal even further, turning death into something routine and administrative rather than sacred, as carts rolled through streets collecting bodies with little ceremony because grief required energy no one had left, and yet few asked whether this system needed to change, because inevitability felt easier than reinvention. While at the household level, compassion unintentionally became dangerous, as isolation felt cruel and unchristian. So families crowded around the sick, holding children, gathering neighbors, sharing beds and air in small, smoky rooms where ventilation barely existed, turning love into a delivery system for illness, reinforced by beliefs that separation might anger God or signal abandonment, and even when quarantine was attempted, it collapsed under inconvenience, argument, and fear, because enduring together felt morally safer than surviving apart, while hunger quietly weakened everyone beneath it all, not dramatic starvation but slow deficiency, diets dominated by bread and repetition, children growing shorter and weaker, immune systems thinning across generations. So when famine finally arrived, it struck bodies already running on empty, made worse by hoarding, collapsed markets, rising prices, and the belief that hunger itself was discipline rather than failure. And when disease and famine did not finish the job, war patiently continued the watched behavior, emotion, and even thought, turning personality itself into something performative, where feelings were not assessed in real time, bringing both clarity and exhaustion, growth and anxiety, because the observer never rested, never. Work, armies crossing the same land repeatedly, burning crops, poisoning wells, stealing livestock, spreading illness as efficiently as any plague, driving civilians into overcrowded cities or forests, ensuring that recovery never fully arrived before the next disaster began, while homes themselves quietly damaged lungs with constant smoke from central hearths, turning coughing and burning eyes into normal parts of life, weakening respiratory systems so that epidemics found easy entry points, even as smoke was believed to purify air rather than poison it. And above all of this hovered tradition, the most dangerous force of all, inherited knowledge treated as unquestionable truth, copied faithfully even when it failed repeatedly, authority valued over observation, confidence over evidence, creating a world where harmful ideas survived longer than people, where being right too early was suspicious, where change moved painfully slowly because certainty felt safer than doubt, and yet, despite bloodletting, poison medicine, persecution, hunger, war, decay, smoke, and unwavering loyalty to terrible ideas, humanity did not vanish, surviving instead through stubborn endurance, through accidental improvements, through small quiet shifts when practices became too deadly to ignore, not because society admitted mistakes but because continuing them became impossible. Learning slowly and unevenly that isolation sometimes worked, that certain water made people sick, that removing blood killed more than it cured, inching forward not through brilliance, but through pressure, adaptation, and survival long enough to question itself, revealing that medieval people were not uniquely foolish but deeply human, clinging to familiarity, obeying authority, fearing uncertainty, and seeking control wherever it appeared, nearly going extinct not from weakness, but from how hard it is to change how you think. And yet here we are, because humanity did not escape the Middle Ages by intelligence alone, but by enduring long enough for bad ideas to soften, fade, or collapse under their own weight, proving that progress often arrives quietly, late, and unwillingly, carried forward not by confidence, but by survival itself. Long before mirrors became ordinary household objects, human identity lived mostly inside the body rather than outside it, shaped by memory, reputation, and the reactions of others, but not by constant visual confirmation, until early reflective surfaces like polished bronze quietly changed something fundamental, allowing elites to rehearse their faces and postures. Learning that calm expressions communicated authority and that control over appearance suggested control over the world itself. While at the same time these mirrors intensified self-scrutiny, making scars, lines, and asymmetries impossible to ignore, turning the self into something public even when alone, which is why many cultures responded not with excitement but caution, covering mirrors, avoiding them at night, and warning against prolonged gazing, not out of superstition alone but as an instinctive psychological defense against a mind still adapting to seeing itself so clearly, and as mirrors became more common. They also reinforced social expectations, especially for women, linking reflection to grooming, judgment, and survival within rigid roles, teaching that to be seen was to be evaluated and that preparation was not vanity but protection, a lesson that deepened when glass mirrors arrived and transformed reflection from an occasional confrontation into a daily habit, offering an image that was brighter, sharper, and unforgiving, returning the same face every time without shadow or softness. Allowing people to see themselves as others likely did, repeatedly and without ceremony, until the self was no longer discovered only through experience but maintained through observation, a shift that subtly rewired the human mind, intensifying self-awareness into self-monitoring as people practiced expressions, corrected posture, and adjusted appearance not for mirrors alone but for imagined audiences, creating a rehearsal space where identity could be refined before entering the world, and with this precision came a new relationship with time, as aging stopped being abstract and became measurable, each new line quietly recorded, forcing comparison not only with others but with past versions of the self, introducing a visual rival to memory itself, and as mirrors standardized reflection they also standardized expectations, defining normal faces, desirable symmetry, and visible deviation, slowly hardening beauty standards that had once been fluid, turning mirrors into silent authorities not because they judged but because they were consistent, showing the same truth regardless of mood, confidence, or fear, until living with reflection created a constant double, the self that acted and the self that watched, a division that emerged naturally without philosophy or education, training people to imagine how they looked even when no mirror was present, internalizing observation so completely that behavior began adjusting itself automatically. Posture softened, expressions moderated, habits corrected in advance, not because someone was watching but because someone might be, and this internal mirror reshaped psychology at its core, offering benefits like empathy, restraint, and deliberate self-control, while also making comparison unavoidable, amplifying insecurity by giving vague doubts a visible target, attaching feelings of inadequacy to specific features, splitting consciousness into lived experience and continuous evaluation, a condition that myths and superstitions tried to explain by framing mirrors as dangerous, soul-trapping, or spiritually revealing, because psychologically a face that stared back without intention or reassurance felt unsettling, breaking the human expectation that faces respond, and as mirrors documented change relentlessly they gained reputations for cruelty even though they merely recorded time, becoming tools for self-examination in religious and philosophical traditions, forcing confrontation with truth. Stripped of narrative or excuse, which some embraced and others avoided, decorating, framing, and ritualizing mirrors to soften their impact, instinctively controlling how much truth was allowed at once. Yet as reflection became embedded in daily routine, it quietly shifted from awareness into discipline, shaping behavior before it occurred, training anticipation, turning identity into something constantly edited, a draft rather than a fixed state, with profound social consequences as appearance became moralized, cleanliness and composure implying character, unkemptness implying failure, standards enforced not by rulers but internally through shame and self-correction, making mirrors powerful tools of social order in complex societies where predictability mattered, even as they narrowed acceptable ways of being and intensified self-criticism by making difference measurable. And over time the mirror no longer needed to exist physically at all, its function having moved fully inside the mind, creating an invisible observer that